Alright, so today we're going to be taking a look at Dragon Ball Sparking Zero on Switch 1 and Switch 2 because this one, it actually ships with two separate builds, a native Switch 1 version and a native Switch 2 version. And I was genuinely curious because Sparking Zero is a big flashy game, you know, set pieces, particle effects, massive energy blasts, all the stuff that usually pushes Switch hardware right to the edge. So the questions today, they're simple. What does the Switch 1 version look like versus the Switch 2 version? And how is the frame rate holding up on both systems? Now, if you do enjoy this breakdown, do me a favor, hit subscribe. I post new Switch performance reviews, deals, and lists weekly. And now, let's get into it. So just very quickly for anyone that might not know, Sparking Zero is the latest entry in the series. Think huge character roster, fast arena battles, big cinematic supers, basically the full Dragon Ball spectacle. It is very much a throw everything at the screen kind of arena fighter, which is why performance, it matters so much. However, just to be clear, this isn't a full review. I will have that live on the channel shortly, so if that's what you're here for, you're in the wrong place, but it is coming. I just suck at the game transparently, so I'm putting the hours in to get through that story and bring you proper coverage. Now, onto the good stuff, and first regarding this upgrade, because I know physical collectors will be wondering. If you do pick up the Switch 1 cartridge, the upgrade is free. I'm pointing that out because the Switch 2 physical release, it's a game key card. The moment, however, you play the Switch 1 build on a Switch 2 system, it automatically updates itself to the enhanced edition. So now let's start with the visuals, and just to explain how I tested things. For all of the footage in today's video, I jumped into quick one-on-one fights and cycled through the exact same selection of maps so I could try to line things up side by side. And honestly, the difference between the two builds is massive. You'll also see me zipping around a lot. I'm trying to grab different angles. It is surprisingly difficult in a game like this because your opponent is constantly just throwing everything in the kitchen sink your direction. Basically, I did my best here to get clean, consistent viewpoints. But yeah, if you need to, look at the top of the screen to see which console is on display at any moment. But look, truthfully, I think it's pretty obvious once you do see them next to each other. Okay, so the visuals, and look, honestly, the upgrade is exactly what you'd expect on paper. Higher resolution, cleaner overall image. But in practice, I think the difference here is night and day on a lot of these maps. The city map especially, it's massive. So on Switch 1, you're getting a really soft image with jagged edges everywhere, character outlines, buildings, shadows. Environmental detail as well, dialed way back. Things like cracks in the ground, road markings, distant buildings, even the texture work on rocks and grass. It is all noticeably stripped back or blurred compared to Switch 2. Damage effects are also heavily reduced. Now on Switch 2, you get wear on the environment, think scorch marks, chunks of terrain breaking away, and just more visible damage on characters during fights. On Switch 1, a lot of that either disappears entirely or it shows up for maybe a split second before fading out. Lighting is a huge one as well. On Switch 2, you actually get depth, stronger shadows under characters, more defined highlights on clothing and hair, and a proper contrast between foreground and background. With the Switch 1, I think it's much flatter by comparison. Skyboxes as well, they lose some color depth. Buildings look washed out, and even things like armor, it just loses that crisp punch. Particle effects then have been dialed back quite a bit too. Attacks don't pop the same way, impact dust is lighter, sparks are way reduced, and those big kind of trails, they lose some density. Even smaller touches, clothing movement, capes, grass, water, smoke, it's toned down on Switch 1. They are still there, but I think you're getting the picture here, simplified. And yeah, basically this holds true across every map I tested. Switch 2 consistently looks sharper, fuller, and more cohesive, while Switch 1 feels like a trimmed down version, built to make sure the game runs. However, all of this is not me saying the Switch 1 version looks bad. In fact, I think it's genuinely impressive what they've managed to pull off now on what is extremely dated hardware. You know, this is a demanding game and the cuts they've made are smart ones. And honestly, kudos to them for putting the effort in to get it running on both systems instead of just skipping the original Switch entirely. Now though, let's talk performance, and this might disappoint some of you. On both systems, the game is capped at 30 FPS. Now I'm sure many of you, like me, were hoping for 60 on Switch 2, but alas, that is not the case. What you do get though is a much smoother and more consistent experience. On Switch 2, you're looking at a mostly locked 30 FPS that felt responsive throughout my testing. Now, if you do watch the graph on screen, you'll spot some tiny fluctuations down to around 29 FPS during heavy visual effects, but these happen in moments when you've lost control anyway. You know, big impact animations, supers, transitions, and honestly, the difference is so small, you'd never feel it. The Switch 1 version though, and I want to say this up front, actually impressed me again. I genuinely expected this one to crawl, but the visual compromises, they clearly paid off. So a good chunk of your time here will be spent hovering around that 30 FPS target. However, it's not uncommon to see dips down into the mid-20s. Now when they do happen, you definitely feel them more than the Switch 2 build. The lowest drop I recorded on Switch 1 was roughly 23 FPS. It was for a brief moment during heavy effects. Now, it never becomes unplayable, but compared directly to Switch 2, those dips are, definitely noticeable. Outside of that, there's a couple of extra things I want to touch on quickly. The menus. On both builds, the image quality really soft. It seems like the Switch 2 upgrade is focused almost entirely on gameplay, which makes sense. The same goes for the rendered intro cutscene. Really don't see any meaningful difference between the two systems. Load times on both versions, surprisingly quick, rarely more than a few seconds. However, the Switch 2 does load faster overall. It gives the whole presentation a bit more of a cinematic feel when you're bouncing between maps or retrying fights. Menu navigation is also noticeably laggier on Switch 1, I will say that. It's not perfect on Switch 2 either, but it's a lot snappier, and it doesn't have that slight delay that you do feel on the older hardware. Finally, the motion controls, and I'll be blunt, right now they appear to be absolutely useless. I tried them, and well, as you can see on screen, you can actually recenter them, but they barely respond to anything that I was doing. I was swinging these Joy-Cons all over the shop and getting almost no reliable input back. Now, I will stick with them a bit longer, give a proper verdict in my full review, but as they stand, they're just frustrating, and for anyone wanting to be even remotely competitive, don't touch them. There's definitely no advantage to be found here. So that's Dragon Ball Sparking Zero on both Switch 1 and Switch 2, and you're getting the full game, the full experience, online, offline, all that good stuff. And in short, the upgrade is absolutely worth it if you're on that newer system, sharper visuals, better effects, tighter lighting, faster loading, and just a much more stable 30 FPS overall. That said, the Switch 1 version, it deserves real credit. It's trimmed back heavily, sure, but it still runs better than I expected, and it's genuinely impressive they got a game this chaotic working on the system, in my opinion, at all. Look as well then, finally, if you are a physical collector, do remember the Switch 1 cartridge upgrading automatically to the Switch 2 build. That's a nice touch too. And yeah, expect my full review live here on the channel very soon. But if you do want to see that or more performance breakdowns, general reviews, deals and lists, do me a favour, hit subscribe, it helps out the channel a huge amount. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers all.